So Peter, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for this week. It's kind of a weird thing. We were chatting a bit before. If we were at the conference, at the hotel, you would sort of come breathless from your session. But when did you do these judges recordings? How long ago was that?
A couple of months ago. So it is really rather strange that this week has been rather relaxing, let's say.
Yeah. Do you still agree with everything you said?
I think so. Yeah.
It could be awkward if you've changed your view since, but no, we really appreciate it. Sure, I'm speaking for everyone. Thank you for doing that, all the work that you've put into that. It's been certainly for me the first time to have a series from the book of Judges. What made you choose Judges?
Yeah, I mean, I was pondering between Life of Abraham and Judges because I want to do something for leaders, and it turned out that John Lennox had done Abraham a number of years ago at the forum, and so I thought that switches me. Having done David already last time I did the plenaries, that's a sort of a whole life, and there's the beauty of that, and that would have been nice. John Lennox had already taken Joseph and Daniel and Abraham, some of those big lives, and so I thought to try and go into Judges, but of course Judges is lots of characters in there, and so you then have the difficulty of having to choose and to shape a series that round a book that isn't designed to be shaped preached in 4 sessions. I mean, it can be preached in 4 sessions, but it's not designed for that, and so you have to decide reluctantly that you're going to leave Deborah and Barak out, really, which is a bit of a shame, and certain things you're not going to be able to focus in on, but hopefully you can give a few tasters and a few themes that are relevant. I've also been speaking on Samson for a number of years, and it seems to me he does speak very much to those sins of lust and of the eye, and also because his life is able to continue with some success after he's indulging these sins. That's a very interesting and slightly scary lesson for leaders.
So yeah, absolutely. So did you kind of start thinking, okay, Judges as a whole, I need to give a sense of the whole, but which bits do I pick, or was it more kind of I want to do Samson, but I'll make it into Judges, or what was kind of your thought process?
Yeah, so, Samson is a story that I've often done as a single Bible study, where I would actually read all of chapters 14 to 16. Now, I read most of chapters 14 to 16. Chapter 13, the birth narrative, is really wonderful, but you can't do that all in one session. So I've often done that as an interactive Bible study. And so that seemed to me a coherent section. Difficulty was going all of chapter 6 through to 12, where, of course, we had to miss out the minor judges, couldn't really do anything on them. And of the 2 stories at the end, if you like, the appendix, chapter 17 through 21, it struck me that the longer one with the Levite's concubine centering on chapter 19 was the most striking. 2021 of the aftermath, but there's a lot to dig down, and I hope it whets people's appetite so that they will go further into it and see how much there is there.
How long do you think an ideal series would be in Judges if you were going to preach it one message a week in a church kind of setting? What would you, because presumably going meticulously, minor detail by minor detail and taking 3 years would be too much, even though it's good.
Yeah. I mean, you could do so. You could go chapter 1 with the pattern of going from conquering to being conquered because of their lack of full obedience. Chapter 2 gives you the cycle. Chapter 3, I mean, I've never heard a sermon on Achsah, and it strikes me that is a fascinating thing, because the Achsah incident happens twice, or is recorded twice, and therefore must be quite significant. But I think Achsah is a bit of a parable of the whole of Judges, because she asks for more. She has the chutzpah to ask her father for, give me the springs of water, which is a huge thing in that context where there's water shortage. And why have the Israelites not asked their father for more? Aksa comes along with her. I mean, her name may be related to the charming jewelry. I mean, it's certainly where the etymology may come. Her father Caleb is happy to grant her request, and so I think there's something there. But I've never heard it preached, and I've not really worked that out. Ehud is just such a fabulous story, so graphic. Shamgar, I mean, what do you do with just that one verse? So I would tend to take Ehud as one sermon. Deborah Barak you could take as 2 or 1. Gideon, you can certainly get more than 1 out of that because it's got its different phases. Abimelech, I think you want to do as 1 because it's it's long. And in one sense, it's the longest continuous narrative, but it's just a mess, and there's not much encouragement from that. Jephthah, I'd tend to do as 1. Samson, I think the birth narrative could be separated off, and you could obviously split that into several. Micah's idolatry, I would take as 1, and the Levite's concubine, you could certainly do more with the aftermath, so you could deal with the horror itself and then the war separately.
So that sounds that's like 25 messages, 20 messages.
Yeah, I mean,
like
you could do it. I think the key thing is, as you are all nutrition specialists as Bible teachers, the key thing is the balance of the diet, not the individual meal.
And so how would that impact it then?
Well, I think the main thing is whether you preach it in 4 or preach it in 25, you are at liberty to do that, just as in Genesis 2, Adam is at liberty to name the creatures as he sees fit. God names things in chapter 1, and then in Genesis 2 says, now you have a go. And that's what the delegation that you have as under shepherds and Bible teachers. So I think there's different ways of doing it, but you do need to lead your sheep to good pasture.
So with these kind of longer Old Testament books, just a question on that before we get back to Judges specifically. When you're dealing with something that isn't Obadiah, is it possible, like presumably there's strengths to all the different approaches, right? Like a 1 message overview, a few messages, dipping in, a kind of a more extended series. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like it's possible, because of what you were just saying, to kind of extend it too far, or to kind of overdo? Does the content change that?
So I think, what we've got is a situation where globally the church aren't getting enough Bible, and they're not getting enough Old Testament specifically, and people are not confident in the Old Testament. And so we do need to spend our time in that. And sometimes we need to take quite a long-term view of what we're doing. So you can get more appreciation from your children if you feed them higher sugar diets. They will prefer that food, but it's not good for them long run. And so I think that's where, as you look at the nutritional balance of the Bible teaching, one of the things is, well, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. That means we want to go everywhere. We want to explore all 66 books that God's given us, and to have a plan to do that. And you've got to look at where your flock is, where your Bible study group is, what stage they're at, and lead them on that path. And you could certainly go too heavy. And I would say not that many congregations are going to be ready for 100 sermons on Jeremiah. And also there's going to be a certain mood to that. And we have to remember that expository ministry of the sort that has become more popular in the last 50 years is a relatively recent thing. That is taking the sort of half chapter length that people often do. In the Bible, we have these whole Bible overviews, and in the Spurgeon model, you take a single verse. I like the expository length that's become fashionable, but again, because I think it's good, it's got a good dynamic to get a narrative flow. It works well. That's what I tend to take. But you have to recognize that then you have the challenge about how you cover everything. So if let's say you're a pastor in a place for 20 years and then you move on, how can you, in those 20 years, have fed your group? Let's say you're a Bible study leader for a couple of years of a small group. How can you give the best thing to that group?
And it's understandable, I think, that we're pulled to the New Testament. Obviously, Gospels have their kind of Jesus centrality to them, and then epistles are much easier to apply, and we tend to sort of cut our teeth as preachers in the epistles a bit more. But you think we need more Old Testament? Why do you think we steer clear of it so much?
Well, I think it is more difficult because the Christological element of the Old Testament maybe, well, it is less obvious. And you then have cultural familiarity is likely to be lower. More people have Greek than have Hebrew. More people think they have a feeling of the Roman Empire than would feel comfortable in, say, knowing what life in pre-exilic Israel was like. So I think there are all these sorts of things which come in, and a book like Jeremiah is very daunting. And some books, I mean, let's say many of the prophetic books are definitely written not to be maximally clear. So Ezekiel is written purposely to be obscure in some ways. I mean, like a crossword, it's meant to be a puzzle, as is the book of Revelation at some level. And so facing that's quite a different dynamic. God could have written the prophets far more clearly than he has. In his great wisdom, he has chosen not to. And so part of that is recognizing that just like an ultra marathon is meant to be hard, so a prophetic book may be meant to be hard. That's fine.
Yeah, I've noticed that over the years in our church where we are, the series we've done in the Old Testament seem to get more positive response, even though it's easier for us as preachers to go back to the New Testament. And I don't know if that's just because there's less of it and we need to do more, but it does seem that people are surprised by how relevant the Old Testament can be and how accessible and how helpful. We haven't done Ezekiel, but certainly in terms of some of the narratives and Daniel and some of those books.
Yeah, so I think there is this thing that there's a hunger for more meat because people are often being fed fast food, and so that they want something more substantial, and they're surprised what's there and what's opened up to them. But I think they do need sometimes a guide to take them into that and to show them what's there.
Do you think that's kind of one of the main roles of the preacher? Because some people might say, well, if God's such a great communicator, shouldn't we just read the Bible and sit down? Like what role does the preacher have?
This whole thing about God being a great communicator, God isn't revealing himself as clearly as he could. God in scripture reveals himself and he hides himself. Both are true. And so clearly at the cross, he is revealing his love in the clearest way, and also he is revealing himself in such a way that someone can stand under the cross and see evidence that the Romans are winning and that the person on the cross is an imposter, and that's how he reveals himself. And so God's revelation is morally structured, so that if you seek, you find, and if you don't seek, you stumble. That's the way his revelation is. So it's not all about making it as easy as possible. Jesus often spoke cryptically, and I think some of Jesus's sayings, for instance, about his second coming, Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, these are somewhat cryptical. He could have said things more clearly. And part of our task is to recognize that, explain, guys, this is meant to be hard. It's okay that it's hard. And then to go into it.
Mm. So one of the challenges that's come up in Judges is some of the hard stuff is kind of objectionable to people. You know, I'm thinking of specific people in my church where I'll read something and I've got no problem with it, but I've been raised with it, and they're coming to it and they say, well, I don't like God if he does that sort of thing. Is preaching the Old Testament part of the answer to that problem in terms of giving people exposure?
Yeah, there could be different levels of it. So part of it is they could simply misunderstand and think that what the Levite did with his concubine was approved by the narrative. And I think I can show, no, it really isn't. The narrative thinks this is terrible. They might be offended by a verse like the verse in Judges 14 that says God was seeking an occasion against the Philistines, and that Samson's parents didn't know this. That's going to need some more explanation about what exactly is going on, about human responsibility, divine sovereignty, and these sorts of things. So some of things people will need a guide with, but I think we mustn't be embarrassed about this text, and we've got to get people's noses into it, because it's incredibly beautiful and powerful. I mean, I find Judges 19 a very powerful passage to share with modern feminists, because here we have this ancient text, thousands of years old, that is exactly concerned about the violence against women that they are concerned about, and that for me is a very powerful thing.
So what do you do with passages that just they kind of, it's hard to get your head around for us, let alone for people listening who aren't familiar with the Old Testament at all? So, for example, you spoke about Jephthah's vow. Mm-hmm. In one sense, you can kind of explain what happened. You can explain that what he did was rash and wrong, and he shouldn't have done it. But then the people are still left with the question: well, why doesn't God step in and do something about it? Why doesn't that daughter get rescued? Yeah,
sure. So, you know, not every story has a happy ending, and that's a sort of generic question about why doesn't God step in and stop all sorts of suffering? I mean, the current conflict in the Middle East and so on. I'd see it as simply part of that. But I would say that one thing I didn't have time to go into is the way in which names in Judges very often fit historically with what's going on, the patterns of names, but also they fit the narrative, and so that's where Jephthah, where it means he opens, and he opens his big gob and makes a mistake. I think that is gob means mouth. Sorry for those who are not native English speakers, it's a slang word. He opens his big mouth, and this is where I think the narrative is really there teaching us the terrible consequences of misspeaking and an unforced error. So I think that the message is very important, and it comes through this tragic story. I'm sorry, it's a tragic story. There are tragic stories in life.
So do you feel that as a preacher, you're obliged to answer the questions that are raised to a level of satisfying people? Or do you feel that sometimes it's okay to point them in a direction of an answer, but leave the tension?
I would often leave the tension. So Jesus doesn't fully answer everyone's question all the time. Again, we're engaged in a moral context where those who seek will find. So I think you point people in the right direction, but you don't have to tie up every loose end. I mean, having said that, tying up loose ends can be a very good thing. So I felt it necessary to explain somewhere at the beginning of the series that fighting physically in Judges is not the lesson we should be taking from it. It's not that we are now called to physical conflict like they were. That was something for the time. But obviously one could have a whole talk just on that subject, but you can't because there's a passage to deal with.
Right. And what do you do with the gore? I mean, you talked about the gore today. You're kind of in a safe environment in the sense, I mean, online, you don't know who's watching, but it's aimed at a group of people attending ELF rather than, how would you change that if you were speaking in a church and there was a full age range or non-Christians present?
I mean, I don't know if I would that much. I mean, I do think you should adapt somewhat for children, although the fact that children were to be there for the reading of the first 5 books of the Bible. There's certain stuff in Genesis 34, 38, and so on, which is, let's say, not very adapted to young people, let's say. And I would want to say the gore for me is part of a pattern where I see, I mean, the way I summarize the Old Testament is God sets things up perfectly, we mess things up, and then we have a whole load of demonstrations of what doesn't work. So in dealing with sin, wiping out humans in a flood and starting with another 8 people won't get rid of sin. Confusing language won't get rid of sin. Choosing an individual like Abraham won't get rid of sin. Rescuing a whole people group from Egypt and giving them a perfect God-given constitution won't get rid of sin. Judges, I see as small government, doesn't get rid of sin. Samuel, Kings, I see as big government, doesn't get rid of sin. Prophets don't, exile doesn't. And God says at the end, so I'm going to send my own son in, which wasn't plan B, it was plan A, but there's a demonstration. So I used to be, if I can get political, I used to be a political libertarian and just think the smaller government gets, the better. Now, I still think there's some case to be made for small government. But what turned me against that was the book of Judges and simply seeing that if you just let human sin loose, there's a problem. Now, there's also a problem with big government because big government have big sinners at the top. So this is part of why you have to get to the gospel as the solution for our problems. And you can have various political models that are not as bad as other ones. But at the end of the day, you can have a perfect constitution written by God and you can still mess up because of human nature. And this to me is a very important lesson as we look out at our world and its messes. So for me, the thought is, yes, you could get rid of government legislation, but what's going to happen is people are just going to take advantage of people, get them onto hardcore drugs. There's going to be people trafficking, all sorts of things are going to go on if you don't have enough government restraint. Now, if you give governments too much power, they're going to become totalitarian, and we've seen all the evils from that. So I think the Bible actually is teaching us something important politically there.
Yeah, absolutely. And as there's different places to go from that, and we'll probably go to all of them, but as you're thinking in terms of Old Testament, these things don't get rid of sin, it's leading to Christ. You're very deliberate about getting to Christ while you're preaching Old Testament. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, to some extent, it's a self-discipline. So I say, look, I'm going to get to Christ and somehow, talk about the cross or Christ in every sermon. Not that I think that you have to, that every sermon could not, but it stops me from wandering. And I think it's, just as Christ gave us the communion, Holy Communion, why? Well, one of the reasons is it just forces you to remember this central thing, and you can't have Christianity without that somewhere at the center. So whether it's whatever group it is that can go astray, there's a sort of anchor that the communion's still at the center. So I do this, but also given Luke 24, I think that it's right to find Christ throughout the Old Testament. Now, that doesn't mean that every single and in the Old Testament is a special picture of Christ. But it does mean when you look at things as a whole, there are lots of reflections of Christ. You could make them overly clear when they're not. So this is where I quite like using the film analogy of the sorts of echoes you might have where a scene earlier in a film is echoed somewhere later in a film. This happens all the time. And it's not that you can say one is the other. It's not that Jephthah is a picture of Christ, or something like this, or David stands for Christ. No, it's rather the whole atmosphere that's set up, and it's a number of different, sometimes pictures by contrast. So I see this happening with Elisha is an obvious case. Elisha, who comes after Elijah, and there's a lot of similarities in his life in terms of the one who has the greater amount of spirit on him, and some of the same multiplying of food he does as Jesus does. There are various, people running away from his tomb, all sorts of things that people have pointed out since the time of at least John Chrysostom, these analogies. And yet you also have these wonderful contrasts. So Jesus blesses the children and Elisha curses them. And so it seems to me that being able to have both similarities and differences can be a very helpful way of seeing how the Old Testament points us and draws us to Christ.
Yeah, so on the first day, I think you said something like, no one picture can do Christ justice.
Yeah.
And I kind of recognize and appreciate that carefulness in how you do it. What would you say are ways that people maybe don't do that carefully, and what's the downside? Like, wouldn't it be better just to go, all guns blazing, this is all about Jesus, and just go full steam ahead? Would that be not a better thing if Christ is the goal?
I don't mind saying Christ is the goal, this is all about Jesus, but something can be about Jesus in the sense that everything is somehow pointing to Jesus without everything having to be directly pointing. So I think probably it's when people are using an equals sign too much. And so they're saying this is that. It's more problematic. Now, you do get a bit of this in the New Testament where Christ is said to be the Passover, or when you use languages of type and antitype. And sometimes people have got quite fixated on these words. And I tend to avoid them, although there's some biblical precedent for them, because I think they're a little bit too precise. And they specify when you can have a whole number of relationships. So I'm more wanting to say that everything somehow contributes to our appreciation of Christ, rather than saying the priest in the Old Testament is Christ, or is just simply a picture of Christ. I think that there are ways of saying that there are obviously analogies between the priest and Christ, and then there are the disanalogies, that they keep on dying and needing to be replaced. And Christ doesn't, he lives forever, as Hebrews tells us. So it's those sorts of things, to appreciate the differences as well as similarities.
Yeah, you seem to kind of honor the Old Testament text in its own right, explain it, work your way through it, spot details in it, and then subsequently talk about Christ, rather than sort of collapsing it in together so that you get the equal sign all the way through. Is that kind of a deliberate strategy, or?
Yes, I mean, it's probably a habit. I mean, I spend a lot of my time thinking and interacting with the secular academy, and of course for them Christ is not in the Old Testament, and so that can probably lead me to think, to some extent, let's do what might be a somewhat secular job, and then how do you put Christ on the end? But I'm trying also not to think like that, because I don't think like that. At the end of the day, I see Scripture as integrated, and I really do think that every single major character in Judges helps us appreciate Christ more, and so I do think we should celebrate that. I mean, for me, it's incredible how Ehud, just in those few verses, we suddenly get this double-edged sword that is the word, the davar of God. This is something very beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate the way you've done it. I think it's been really, really helpful this week and last time with David as well. So thank you for that. I think that's a good example for us as preachers, because there's voices that can go very strong in different directions, and sometimes a good thing can become an overdone thing that loses its impact.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I think that's really sensible and helpful. In terms of preparation, when you're preparing a message, let me just throw a few kind of quick questions at you for that. In a nutshell, I don't know if that's possible, but do you have a sort of a typical process when you're preparing a message?
So at one level, your life is the preparation. I think it's very important to distinguish between an itinerant speaker like myself and a pastor who is regularly in the same church, because you may be having to come up with 50 or 40 new messages or 80 or 100 new messages per year, and do that for 5, 10, 15 years. And this is an incredible demand. Whereas itinerant preachers like me are able to refine our messages and reuse them and so on. And when we go speak somewhere, we like to use our better ones. And once you've used them a few times, hopefully they get better than they were before. And people can make very, very unhelpful comparisons. And it's important for any of us who are itinerants to make sure that we are not undermining the local preachers by going in and doing something which will be very appreciated, but also compared unfavorably with the local preachers. And we need to explain that, you know, the local preacher has this exhausting experience on the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or whenever it is, where they're wrestling with this and they have to deliver for that deadline. So I think this is a very different thing. So I began thinking about these four talks years ago, you know, probably a couple of years ago. And I've been speaking on Judges a long, long time ago, speaking on Samson and so on. So I think I've had the luxury of being able to allow my thoughts to mature. Now, what I absolutely hate sermon preparation, just as I hate writing. I hate ordering my thoughts because I just find it very energy draining. So for me, the crafting of a talk does come fairly last minute, I'm afraid, and that's just my temperament. And you may well see that, you know, my talks weren't super polished. Now, I do take some comfort from this, that Winston Churchill's talks I don't think were super polished. Although people talk about him as a brilliant speaker, he does stumble over words. The rhythm of his speaking is nothing like as perfect as a modern politician's rehearsed speech is, but the content is riveting. And I think that's where I would say, I know that I sometimes say and in sermons, and now and then I lose the rhythm. Certain times you will suddenly gain that, and a whole load of things will come out very quickly and probably with some force. But other times it's not like that, and it can feel like you're scraping around. But I hope the content is worthwhile and people would stick through that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in a sense, what you're saying is you kind of swim in the content for a period of time.
Yeah.
And then you kind of pull it together in order to present.
Yeah.
When you're swimming in the content, what does that look like? I
do learn a lot from interactive Bible studies. So I learn a lot from my house group. I mean, it's funny, you know, I'm the trained biblical scholar, but I learn stuff from just people seeing things. I remember, you know, going through the story of Samson with a group of investors, and there were a couple of it was mainly men, and so I sort of talked about pornography. And this is a problem. And one of the women came to me afterwards and said, have you not thought about how Delilah manipulates? And I really hadn't, you know, and you learn these things from people who just see things from a different perspective. So obviously books are useful, and learning original languages is useful. Or if you can't learn original languages, reading in other translations. So I like to read the Bible in different translations, sometimes other languages, because it slows you down. It means that you have to pause over things. And often in another language, you notice a repeated word, which you wouldn't notice in your own language because it's so familiar. But when you have to slow down, you suddenly see, whoa, this word is happening a lot. That helps you realize what's going on. So suddenly, Jephthah is talking about inheritance again and again, and then you think, yeah, and he was told by his brothers he couldn't inherit, and then you're suddenly thinking about what that might mean in terms of his character.
What do you think about languages for preachers? That it's much easier if you've gone through, you know, college, seminary, university, whatever, and you've had the opportunity. Yeah. But for an awful lot of people, yeah, it feels out of reach. Is it worth reaching and getting something, or is it better not to bother at all? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I would say, I'm just putting a link in the chat. I would use stepbible.org, which is designed for people who don't have Greek and Hebrew, and you can simply call up the English and click on that and get through to the Greek and Hebrew. Now, I think it's also aligned with Chinese and will be with Swahili, and eventually they'll do other European languages. But certainly it allows you to search and align without a familiarity with the languages. The key thing is to know a little knowledge is not dangerous, provided you know you have a little knowledge. And also provided you're surrounded by lots of people who do have knowledge. So if I started talking now about the ideal healthy diet, the great thing is there are enough people who know about healthy diets that very quickly they would say you're talking rubbish. And so if you are the only person with any expertise and you start talking about something, people treat your words as having too much authority. But I think provided you recognize the limits of your knowledge, then it's okay to dabble. And the other thing is, biblical languages are not somehow particularly different from European languages. I mean, obviously, New Testament Greek and modern Greek are the same sort of language. There are differences. And what that means is that you can relate to these and the questions that there are. And remember that languages are not magical. Just as in any of our languages, a word might mean different things in different contexts, and you have to have some common sense to tell the difference. That's probably the most important thing with biblical languages, some common sense. And so look into these things and use it to spot thematic connections. But try not to use it to create new heresies. This is what people have done sometimes, is they use a small amount of knowledge to try and solve a problem, and they end up creating a new heresy, and just avoid that.
And to protect you from that, what's your view of commentaries? How would you kind of advocate for and against? Kind of what are the dangers? What are the benefits?
Yeah. So commentaries can be good. I mean, I don't read that many commentaries because I tend to find that they're telling me things that I know already. But so I think the more biblical language you've got, the lazier you can be, the less you're reliant on a commentary. And also we know that commentary writers don't have time to read all the other commentaries because there are so many commentaries now. So I think a good commentary can be a wonderful set of insights into how something hangs together. But I haven't read a lot of commentaries on Judges, I'm afraid. I have read quite a bit on Judges. Sometimes a special study will be more helpful than a commentary. But certainly, I think, pastors and regular preachers do need to use commentaries.
When you say a special study, do you mean journal article or
something like that? There might be a particular question. So I had to read an article by a guy who was arguing that Eglon wasn't really fat. That wasn't the meaning of the word, and I'm convinced he was, and the traditional rendering's okay, but you have to do some due diligence on those sorts of things.
One of the things I've heard people do, which makes me twitchy, is correcting Bible translations from the pulpit. Typically, that tends to come from people that aren't particularly expert in the language. Yeah. Do you have any? You must have views on that. I'm sure you've heard.
Yes, I do, I think avoid it unless you absolutely have to. Try and avoid it, and there are quite a few reasons. I mean, someone like John Calvin in his sermons didn't mention Greek and Hebrew. In his lectures, he did, but he knew them, but he didn't, because it's a useless waste of knowledge. Secondly, a lot of the people you're talking to will not understand how language works. Many people are good at speaking, but they don't think reflectively about how language works, and so they tend to think of as a word as like carrying around the same meaning to every place. It's like a bag that carries the contents everywhere, and that's not how words work. Actually, they activate meanings in particular settings. So and people are likely to mishear you. So even if you're quite likely to make mistakes anyway when you explain it, but even if you explain things correctly, you will probably be misunderstood. Then thirdly, you're undermining people's confidence in the only thing that they have, which is the translation in front of them. Now, I don't mind if you say we have two translations here, and I think that this translation is the better one. Sometimes you can put it positively because you have a more literal translation here and an easier to understand translation here, and you can say they each bring out something, and this is important. But why would you undermine people's confidence in the translations? The translations we have in European languages are generally very good. Now, I do like literal translations, and I think literal translations tend to be ones that you don't need to correct from the pulpit as often. You might need to explain them, but you can usually connect the point you're making to the translation more easily. So that would be my preference in order to avoid even having to make those corrections in the first place. But there can be, in different languages, that may not be appropriate. I mean, or different contexts, it just may be too obscure or difficult.
One more thing on preparation. One of the things that I think a lot of preachers really appreciate is kind of historical and cultural background, kind of extra biblical material that sheds light so that we can then explain the passage better. What's your view on that stuff? And like, how should we be using it? How should we be using it?
Yes. So I think there's a justification for using it from Acts chapter 2, where Peter explains that from archaeological evidence, Psalm 16 can't be about King David because King David's tomb is there archaeologically, it's still around. So I think it's okay to use extra biblical material to explain a biblical passage. However, I do think it is like chili or mustard. What I mean is these are great things to have in a recipe if you don't put too much in. But if you put too much in, it kills the food. It really just makes it uneatable. And so I think there are people who I call backgroundists. And what they say is, the text seems to say this, but really when we go into the background, it says that. And it's a form of Gnosticism where effectively you say that God has not spoken clearly, and it all depends on the background. And I think often the background that people appeal to is simply false. There's lots of misinformation out there. Sometimes it depends on, oh, there's a Jewish custom that said this, but the Jewish custom isn't attested till hundreds and hundreds of years later. Or it says the ancient Near Eastern text says this, but the ancient Near Eastern text is in a less well understood language than the Old Testament. And so what you're using is you're explaining ignotum per ignotius, an unknown through an even more unknown. This is not a good thing to do. So I would say that background is in the recipe 5, 10, or 15%. It's not 50%. It's just having that. And I spend my time, at Tyndale House, we spend most of our effort on background research. It's a huge thing. I am not devaluing it. I think that evangelicals should invest very large resources in background research. But at the end of the day, we've been given scripture in a way that is morally clear. It's not that all of scripture is clear, but it is clear morally in terms of what we have to do. And we need to recognize and affirm that, and recognize that people can use extra biblical information as a way of avoiding the impact of the text.
That's super helpful. Thank you. So shifting gears slightly, in our culture, it feels like the culture is shifting in lots of ways. And the impact of the shift is, it feels like, either currently or future going to be very critical of Bible, in terms of lots of different angles on that, in terms of free speech and hate speech and disinformation and fact checking and all the kind of current trends. What do you see going on, and kind of how do you feel we should be responding to that as Bible people?
Yes, well, there's a mixture. I mean, from everything that's going on, I think in Finland there's a former MP who's in deep trouble for quoting Bible verses, and yet we also see someone like Jordan Peterson getting millions of people attend his lectures when he talks about the Bible. And so I think that there are contrary trends, not to give up. There is a tendency nowadays for people to be objecting to the Bible morally. That's the main thing. It's not, this didn't happen. And there is a tendency for people to be asking the historical questions secondly. So whether or not the stories about Jesus are true, they first want to know whether they're moral. So I think that's where a pandemic and all sorts of opportunities like this, I mean, it's a tragedy, obviously, but it gives us an opportunity to show the power of the gospel. Christians at work, doing good in the culture, there's always going to be pain, always going to be suffering. And when Christians are ministering in those contexts, people see the credibility of the gospel. And yes, they will often object and find Christianity immoral and intolerant and so on. But I think if we are living the gospel out, there will be opportunities to witness from that.
Was it in a past generation, was the historicity of the scripture more of an issue? And are we in danger of being sort of stuck in the past if we focus on that?
So I think that in the 19th century, the big question was, did it happen? There were moral questions in addition, but the assumption was scripture is largely moral. Is it historically true? Christians, in response to that, I think retreated and focused on the moral and didn't want to defend the historical. And part of that is you don't want to be falsified. You don't want to be proven to be false. And so obviously people then started attacking the moral. I think we should focus on the historicity, even if no one else is, because the danger is we can just be heard as talking of Christianity as an inner conviction, a feeling, a moral system, rather than true truth about the universe as real as a virus or a vaccine or anything else that we focus on. So I think focusing on history and as a real thing is something, even if no one is asking about, we should do as part of our messaging to ensure that we are claiming the territory of, we're talking about real earth, as real as your paycheck, we're talking about that. But obviously where the culture may be is asking about those moral questions, and I think that they need to be tackled head on. But I wouldn't want to divert all of our energies to just the reactively responding to the culture. I think it's very important for us to know that this is real and three-dimensional.
Right, and the historicity of it, when established, implies the moral questions anyway, right? Because if
Yes.
Jesus rose from the dead, literally, physically, that has implications.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's very important for us to be able to keep a focus on the fact that, you know, when people say, why doesn't God show himself, the answer is he has. And for us to be able to keep the focus on the historical is very important. And also it does interact with the moral questions, because if you believe that God boomed the 10 commandments from the mountains, from the Mount Sinai, in a loud voice so that 603,550 men heard, that makes a material difference to the question of the morality of invading the Holy Land, because it's objective evidence that this is something that should be done, not just a subjective feeling. And the danger is people think that you're simply saying, if you have a conviction in your mind that God is saying to do something, you should do it. And we're not saying that. We're saying when it is objectively evidence with miracles and God speaking, that uniquely gave Joshua the authority to invade the land.
Right, and so some of the challenges that we get now are sort of pushing us into a subjective type of a situation, aren't they? Where we're defending an idea or a conviction or my truth and all these kind of things. Where do you see that those trends going in terms of, like, for example, it seems like we quite easily get thrown in with other religious fundamentalists and dismissed because fundamentalism is dangerous, or you know, do you see that that's just going to carry on as it is, or are there some specific challenges that we're going to be facing?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, people like to have boxes they can put things in, but some of what they understand Christianity to be is related to our own messaging. So sometimes they can mistake what it's about, but usually, at least in some level, it reflects what we say things are about. And so what that means is if we bang on a lot about history, people will eventually recognize that that is an important part of what we're claiming. And so I do think it's important that we don't just say this is just, we don't make it sound like it's a moral system. And we do need to keep on talking about Christ historically, Christ, a real person, God incarnate. This is the difference fundamentally between Christianity and anything else.
Yeah, in the past, we've been kind of protected, I think, in many of our cultures by the sort of Judeo-Christian ethos. Even if the vast majority of the culture are not Christian, there's sort of that legal protection that I think Christians have grown used to. That seems to be slipping away very quickly. So issues now like what defines gender, or sexuality, identity, all those kind of things, it's no longer a different opinion out there. It's becoming the prescribed opinion. But we differ from that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the gender question is a very interesting thing, because we align with some of the very hardcore evolutionary atheists on this, who are saying biology really matters, and we align with some of the hardcore feminists on this, who say no, there really is a difference between men and women. And different things are happening in Europe with, say, the whole question of transgender, where how this is going to end up is difficult to see at the moment, because it's a big fight. There are some victories for sanity being won in the UK, but not just in the UK, elsewhere as well, with I think it's Sweden having reversed use of puberty blockers for teenagers. So I think there's everything to play for, and on some of these issues we may make alliances, strange alliances. Again, that's got to be separated out from Bible teaching and teaching the gospel, where these people have a very, very different view from us, but there may be some political common ground.
There's a tendency, isn't there, for us as Christians to see something as controversial, pull back from it and say, I'm just going to preach the gospel, rather than engaging with those issues, recognizing their significance.
Yes, and I think that's problematic. I mean, I think that the gospel is all encompassing, and there does come a point when, although we want to emphasize that you could be politically in a number of places as a Christian, there are certain things that you can't just be silent about because of the horrors that are going on, and whether that's abortion or the final solution of the Third Reich, or whatever it is. There are things that we have to speak out against.
In your own background, this might seem like a kind of random question, but in my mind it connects. It's obvious your kind of scholarship and education has been a key factor, but I also know you've been quite involved with United Beach Missions, and kind of just out there on the beach, holiday makers and proclamational evangelism.
Yeah.
How has that influenced you, and how do you kind of see that our role moving forward evangelistically in a antagonistic culture?
Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly been a great discipline. So for 20 or more years, I've done beach missions, say in Belgium, sometimes in France, and just with children on the beach, playing games, teaching them the gospel. Now, my French is not that good. I mean, I can speak some, but it's not that good. And I'm not just being modest. When you're there and you have a Cambridge PhD and you're talking to a 6-year-old native French speaker, they are not impressed by your PhD. They just see you as an idiot because you can't really speak their language properly. And it's a very humbling experience. And you have to simplify what you're doing. I mean, none of the books on the shelf count for anything. And so I do think it's been helpful to try and learn to simplify things, and also just be very down to earth, because you have to meet people, and you might be doing an open air talk and you're talking to them for the very first time, and trying to pull rank, show authority. This is going to get you absolutely nowhere. And sometimes the best thing to do is let things run. So the person you're talking to may know far less about the subject than you, but they think they know more. Just let them talk. Let them talk for a long time, and eventually they'll say, "And what do you do?" Or and they might ask a question, and then you have a chance, not to try and make them feel small, but you have a chance to point them to the fact that so much of what people believe nowadays is a moral choice. Just as nowadays people choose which media they want to listen to, because we can all choose media which will exactly reinforce what we want to believe. It's a market out there. You can have whichever opinions you like by experts. This is something that's predicted, as people have itching ears and they heap up teachers. This is what we can have nowadays. And so to recognize that moral element we're in, and how the master Jesus spoke in such simple ways, and that undercut it's one of the best ways of cutting through baloney or hogwash. These are English words. If you don't know, they're good to learn. Nonsense.
How do we engage with that? Obviously it would be simplistic and in some ways true to say we want to be letting Jesus have the biggest voice. We want to be biblically saturated and, you know, discerning because of it. At the same time, there is a danger that we only listen to one narrative outside of scripture. You know, it could be the mainstream media's version of things. It could be the counterpoint. You know, like you say, we can kind of pick the voices we want. What's the kind of the right thing to do as Christian leaders in that? Because presumably it's not helpful to just be narrow.
So I think we are in a difficult position about information right now, and it's probably going to get worse, because by the time of, let's say, the next US election, deep fake videos will be there where that you can look, it can look like anyone has said anything. And so we have this problem that with the internet generally. So I do think it's important to get your news from multiple sources. We do know that mainstream media often has an agenda not to talk about an important story. We also know that there are lots of people outside of the mainstream media who are ignorant and conspiracy theorists and all sorts of very unhealthy things. Basically, we know that humans lie. So knowing that, we've got to focus quite hard on the quality of information. We've got to be prepared to suspend our judgment about many things. We simply don't know, and be fine with that. And we need to focus on local information. That is things that we, or relationships we actually have. So for me, hearing from a nurse I know how full the hospitals are in Britain, for me counts as quite a high quality of information that I'm getting. Hearing it from some other source may be less high quality. And so that's where I think that recognizing the limits, I mean, humans are very, very limited in their knowledge. God knows everything. Our Heavenly Father knows everything. We know a tiny amount. Accepting that the top scholar in the world knows a tiny amount, accepting in a pandemic that some people know more than others, but no one knows that much. That's all part of what you do, and accepting that when you come to cultural critique, cultural analysis, even the top cultural analysts only see part of their culture. They're always incomplete, and that's fine. So we're driven back to scripture, which is written by someone who's omniscient, but we also are gathering information from other sources.
Last couple of questions as we're kind of coming towards the end. Have you read anything recently that you found particularly soul nourishing, apart from the Bible?
Well, that's a very good question. What have I? I'm trying to think what I may not have done. I mean, nothing substantial. Sorry. That's
all right.
A really bad answer. Yeah.
That's not a problem at all. If okay, different question. Your book, Can We Trust the Gospels?
Yeah,
which is excellent. And I really appreciate it. If you were going to recommend something helpful along those lines to somebody who, you know, maybe they've been in the church for years, but they're just starting to kind of get their feet under them studying stuff, what would you recommend in terms of helpful material, where to start, you know, on the sort of apologetic or establishing the truths that we're talking about? Any kind of guidelines? And I'm giving you one. Mention your own by all means.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's hard, and it depends how much they already know.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think study Bibles can be helpful. The ESV study Bible, the NIV study Bible, these can be good ways of getting into things more. And there are all sorts of, if I can say, fancy Bibles nowadays. I mean, the ESV comes with a Reformation Creeds Bible and an archaeology study Bible and all sorts. So I think that it's the habit of reading the Bible and sometimes reading through one set of comments as you do that. That can be a a helpful thing to do, and a good project, say, to have for a calendar year is to read through a Bible plus all the commentaries, all the comments within a study Bible.
Yeah, that's really helpful. How can we be praying for you? You've ministered to us this week, but
yeah, so pray for me as I'm trying to write a book about Jesus, which might be something like Jesus the Genius, about how clever Jesus is in his parables. And I'm struggling with who to write it for. Should I write it for a non-Christian, or should I write it for a Christian audience? And I'm struggling with that. God's given me really good hearing for 50 years, but 5 weeks ago I lost all hearing in my right ear, and apparently it's permanently gone. So I'm having to adjust to just hearing through one ear. So you might pray for good adjustment there, but I'm very grateful to God for everything he's given me, and that I would learn through this. So very happy to share what I can with you.